Hi everyone. So this is my first, well that's a lie, this is my second attempt at recording this lecture using this new fancy tool. I have a big microphone in front of me now. Before you couldn't hear the audio, so this should work. If this is good and easy and you guys like it, we'll try and do this more this semester. Endocrine. This is Endocrine 2. I told you on Tuesday that we would be going through the endocrine system gland by gland. And so this lecture is pituitary, thyroid, and parathyroid. And the next lecture will be adrenal and other glands that I'm not remembering off the top of my head. Sorry about that. So we're going to go through them gland by gland. In the lectures, when you get in on Tuesday, we're going to go through them hormone by hormone, or you will be building your wiki page by hormone instead of by gland, because that's another really useful way to look at the endocrine system, and hopefully doing it both ways will kind of help integrate all the information. These are your learning objectives. I am not going to read them. I will let you guys do that. And we're going to start right in with the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is basically on the ventral surface of the brain. Okay, so here we are in the brain, and this is the midbrain that they've blown up here, and there's the third ventricle, and this is the medial surface of the hypothalamus, which is absolutely essential for this hormonal system and the functioning of the pituitary gland. So you have the hypothalamus, and then hanging off of it is the pituitary. It's hanging by a little section called the pituitary stalk, or the infundibulum, which is a great word. And the pituitary itself is divided into two lobes. The anterior lobe in the front, oh, lost my pointer, there it is. The anterior lobe in the front, or the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe in the back, or the neurohypophysis. And we're going to look at them together, and then we're going to kind of take it apart and look at the anterior lobe first and then the posterior lobe. So here are the hormones that the pituitary secretes. From the anterior pituitary, you have a whole bunch of different hormones. You can remember them by this acronym FLAGTOP, only there's no O. So it's just in there, so it makes sense, but it's doesn't actually have a hormone associated with it. So there are 6. The F, follicle stimulating hormone, the L, luteinizing hormone, the A, ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, the G is growth hormone, the T is thyroid stimulating hormone, and the P is prolactin. From the posterior pituitary, you have only 2 hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Okay, let's start with the anterior pituitary. By definition, hormones are released into what? All hormones of any kind are released into the blood, okay? So there must be some blood going on here, and indeed there is. The anterior pituitary configuration is a little bit complicated because it involves 2 major steps, all right? The first one is up here starting in the hypothalamus. So these hypothalamic neurons, okay, they're cell bodies residing up here in the hypothalamus, secrete something called a releasing hormone, okay? A releasing hormone is secreted into this first capillary bed that's right here at the top of the infundibulum, okay? This system, this kind of artery capillary bed and these veins, that's called a portal system, specifically the hypophyseal portal system, or portal veins. So the releasing hormones get secreted into this portal system at the first capillary bed, and they travel down into the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so that's the first hormone, comes into the anterior pituitary gland. That's the step right there. Vessels merge, and then they are carried to the adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary gland. And then those hypothalamic hormones act on their target cells in the anterior pituitary. And they each have a specific target cell. The target cells then release stimulating hormones which travel out of the pituitary gland through the hypophyseal veins and away into the body, where they stimulate other parts of the body, including some other endocrine glands. Okay? So, a few steps. Hypothalamic neurons secrete the releasing hormones into this capillary bed. They travel through the hypophyseal portal veins, where they stimulate the secretory cells, which secrete stimulating hormones. And they travel out of the pituitary gland through the hypophyseal portal vein, through the hypophyseal veins, and out into the body. Let's look at this a little bit closer. Well, this is looking at that closer in a schematic, but also looking at the negative feedback loop for the anterior pituitary hormones. At least generally, most of the hormones fit this loop. So, walking through this, okay, hypothalamus stimulates, green arrow, plus sign, okay, the anterior pituitary with a releasing hormone, all right? So hypothalamus releases a releasing hormone, stimulating the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases hormone 2, whatever hormone that is, which stimulates a peripheral endocrine gland, okay? So it could be the thyroid or the adrenal gland or the ovaries or the testes. But that hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to stimulate another gland, and that's going to release a third hormone, okay? So that's the hormone that will have an effect on target cells. Now, how does this thing get shut off? Well, usually, there's two ways. Oftentimes, it's this level of hormone 3, okay? So this whole pathway happens, and this hormone is secreted in large amounts, and it travels up, and the concentration of this hormone then inhibits the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, okay? Inhibits, red arrow, minus sign. So if this hormone is in large enough concentrations, it will feed back and turn off these hormones, which then will, of course, shut down this cycle. Hormone 2 from the anterior pituitary also can feed back and inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing more releasing hormone. So there's a couple ways, but generally all the anterior pituitary hormones fit this schema for the negative feedback inhibition. Now this is a really great figure, okay? This shows all the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, what they affect and how, and then the final targets in the body, okay? I also have on here, since the title of the slide is the secretory cells of the anterior pituitary, a list of the specific cells in the anterior pituitary gland that release these different hormones. And the names make sense, okay? So follow along with me. GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. SS, somatostatin. Okay, so these are hormones from the hypothalamus. They are released into the blood because, of course, that's what this big red tube is, the blood, right, in that first capillary bed. And they travel to the anterior pituitary gland. There, they affect somatotropes. Okay, so somato, body. Somatostatin, this is the inhibitory one. Growth hormone releasing hormone is the stimulation one. They affect somatotropes. The GHRH increases the secretion of growth hormone. The somatostatin inhibits secretion of growth hormone. Growth hormone is released into the blood from the anterior pituitary, and it goes out and affects bone, muscle, and adipose tissue. And you can see here the PRF, prolactin releasing factor, and the prolactin release inhibiting hormone, PRIH, travel from the hypothalamus, and they affect mammotropes, okay? Mammary glands, mammotropes, that's the ultimate target. Prolactin's job is to increase milk production, so they either activate or inhibit the secretion of prolactin from the anterior pituitary so it can have its effect on the mammary glands. TRH from the hypothalamus acts on thyrotropes to secrete TSH from the thyrotropes, which act on the thyroid. CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, acts on corticotropes to release ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then goes on and affects the adrenal cortex, which is the outer part of the adrenal gland. And then GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, secretes or it causes the secretion of LH and FSH from the gonadotropes, which go on and affect the ovaries and testes and have their effects differently in males and females, of course. But what you can take from this is the hormones from the hypothalamus, these nice pathways, how they affect these 5 different types of cells, which each match up with a stimulating hormone, and then finally the ultimate targets of these hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So we're going to look at this a little closer still, okay? Oh, sorry about that. Okay, first one, growth hormone releasing hormone and somatostatin, okay? The secretory cell is the somatotrope, right? Growth hormone stimulates, as you might expect, growth, okay? And growth hormone is kind of funny because its secretion varies depending on time of day, all right? You actually release more growth hormone at night, so there's some truth to that. You grow at night kind of thing. And also, of course, growth hormone is released in different quantities over the course of life. So you're going to have more secretion of growth hormone during childhood. You have more secretion of growth hormone, which causes growth spurts, and you have lots of secretion of growth hormone, particularly during puberty. Whenever there's a large amount of growth, you can associate that with more growth hormone. So growth is kind of the general effect of growth hormone, of course. What does growth mean? Growth means you are increasing the rate of cell division, right? You're adding cells, more mitosis, more cells. You're increasing the rate of protein synthesis, okay? Making more proteins. Growth hormone also decreases the rate that cells use carbohydrates and increases the cell's use of fats, okay? So for energy, if you have lots of growth hormone, you're going to use more fats for energy than you are carbohydrates. Next one to look at is prolactin releasing factor, prolactin inhibiting hormone. Okay, so these are the activating and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. They come down and act on the mammotropes in the anterior pituitary to cause either the release or the inhibition of prolactin, which then causes milk production in the mammary glands. So again, this is one that you're going to have more of at different stages of life, particularly after childbirth. You're going to have milk production for breastfeeding. Males do have prolactin, but science has not yet figured out what it is used for. So we don't know why males have prolactin. There's probably a reason, but we haven't established it yet. So that is a hot area of research. And then the third one to point out right now is thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, which is from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary, and that, of course, affects the thyroid. And the cells that secrete TSH are the thyrotropes, and that affects the thyroid. And we're going to look at this a little bit closer. So the anterior pituitary hormone that we're talking about here is thyrotropin, also known as TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. I'll usually say TSH, but if I say thyrotropin, I'm talking about the same thing, okay? And I wanted to put this slide up there to show you really how pretty this negative feedback cycle is, because it perfectly fits the schema that I went over earlier, and to get you used to kind of interpreting these figures, because they're going to be really helpful. If you can draw one of these to know the negative feedback cycle and how the hormones are regulated, that's going to be a really helpful thing. So the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin, are to stimulate, right here, the secretion of thyroid hormones from the thyroid. So TSH stimulates the thyroid, and then it secretes more hormones. Right? So let's look at this. This whole process starts up at the hypothalamus, okay? Anterior pituitary hormones are all under control of the hypothalamus. They're all under nervous system control. So TRH is released from the hypothalamus, okay, stimulates the thyrotropes in the anterior pituitary gland. So there's your green arrow, stimulation. And then they are released into the bloodstream. So blue arrow means released into the bloodstream. So TSH is released into the bloodstream and travels through the blood until it finds its target cells in the thyroid gland. Okay? Stimulation. So it stimulates the thyroid gland, which then releases thyroid hormones into the bloodstream. Blue arrow. The thyroid hormones go on and stimulate their own target cells. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And this increase in thyroid hormone levels inhibits the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland from secreting more TRH and more TSH. So if these levels go up, this gets inhibited, so the levels drop, and then they're not inhibited anymore, and it's just a big, beautiful negative feedback circle. Question I have here is, what is the condition called when excess TSH enlarges the thyroid? So that is another effect of TSH on the thyroid, is that it causes growth of the thyroid gland. It actually makes it bigger. So the effect of TSH on the thyroid is to stimulate thyroid hormones and cause the growth of the thyroid gland. If you have excess TSH, if this negative feedback loop is broken for some reason, then that thyroid gland will keep getting stimulated over and over and grow and grow and grow, and what you end up with is something called a goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid gland in the neck. Okay, moving on from there, we're going to talk about this in great detail in the next lecture, but CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone, stimulates the release of ACTH from the corticotropes in the anterior pituitary gland, and that goes on and stimulates the adrenal cortex. And when you guys see adrenal, you should be thinking adrenaline. You should be thinking noradrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, fight or flight, okay? This pathway is stimulated by emotional and physical stress in particular, but it's also active during your daily life. And then finally, the GnRH, or the gonadotropin releasing hormones, stimulate the release of both LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary, which go on and act on the ovaries and the testes. More specifically, so you know the different effects in males and females, gonadotropins in males stimulate, like follicle-stimulating hormone, stimulates the production of sperm in the testes, and in luteinizing hormone stimulates the secretion of testosterone. In females, the follicle-stimulating hormone controls the growth and development of follicles that hold the egg cells, okay, so in the ovaries, and also stimulates the follicular cells of the ovaries to secrete estrogen and progesterone. So FSH causes the secretion of more hormones, of the female estrogens, and the growth and development of the follicles that hold the egg cells. So this kind of happens at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, and then the luteinizing hormone's job is to stimulate the release of the egg cells from the ovaries. So there's a luteinizing hormone surge that causes ovulation, and we will look at that in a lot of detail in April when we talk about reproduction and pregnancy. Okay, so that's the anterior pituitary, but we're not done with the pituitary because there's a whole separate section. Now, the posterior pituitary gland is kind of funny. All of the pituitary, anterior and posterior, are under control of the brain, okay? Because they all basically start in the hypothalamus, so there's nervous control. But in the posterior pituitary, it basically is a part of the nervous system. The neurons that cause the release of posterior pituitary hormones are hypothalamic neurons. Their cell bodies sit in the hypothalamus, okay? And when there's an action potential, it travels down into the posterior pituitary, and the hormones are released directly into the blood from those axon terminals. So they're in vesicles inside the neurons, they travel down, and they're released from from the ends of the neurons directly into the blood. So it's a neuronal effect. The hormones are, instead of secreted from cells, like glandular epithelial cells, they're secreted from neurons, and they're carried away, again, by hypophyseal veins. Okay, so there's the capillary bed in the posterior pituitary, because hormones are secreted into blood, and off they go. There are two posterior pituitary hormones. They are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And we'll look at ADH first. So ADH is also called vasopressin. Vasopressin should say to you something about blood vessels and blood pressure, and indeed that is one of the effects, okay? But antidiuretic hormone. So what's a diuretic? A diuretic is something that causes you basically to lose water, to urinate a lot. Things that are diuretics cause frequent urination. Thus, an antidiuretic must do the opposite, and that's exactly right. It causes your body to retain fluid, to hold on to water. So the two effects of ADH, the primary one is the fluid retention. If you have ADH, it's going down, it's working on the kidneys, okay, and it's causing the kidneys to hold on to water, to keep it in your body, to excrete less urine. The second effect of ADH is blood vessel constriction. Now this effect is kind of rare, okay? If your blood vessels constrict, then you increase blood pressure. That's just kind of standard. Now there's not normally enough ADH in your system to increase blood pressure, but ADH is secreted in really great quantities after extensive blood loss. So if you have some kind of trauma where you lose a lot of blood or some kind of hemorrhage, ADH is secreted to constrict the blood vessels to minimize the drop in blood pressure that accompanies that blood loss. If you lose a lot of blood, you lose blood volume, you lose blood pressure. If you constrict all your blood vessels because of ADH, you're going to bring that pressure back up a little. It's not going to be such a severe drop. So that's the secondary effect of ADH. ADH is regulated by a receptor in the blood. I'm going to keep going with this. ADH is not a receptor in the blood, I'm sorry, a receptor in the hypothalamus called an osmoreceptor. Okay? So an osmoreceptor, let me get this back up. All right, so I added the word. An osmoreceptor is a receptor that senses changes in osmotic pressure. If you remember osmotic pressure, what that means is when osmotic pressure goes up, you're increasing the concentration of solute in the blood compared to water. So you're getting dehydrated, right? If you get dehydrated, your solute concentration goes up, your osmoreceptors sense that, and they trigger the hypothalamic neurons to release ADH. ADH then goes down to the kidney and causes you to hold on to water, and so the osmoreceptors don't get that stimulation from the high osmotic pressure anymore. So, knowing that mechanism, what is a recreational drug that inhibits ADH? So you should be thinking about something that doesn't allow you to retain fluid, that makes you dehydrated, and urinate frequently. So you're probably thinking, at least I hope you're thinking of alcohol, which is exactly one of its mechanisms. So alcohol, even though you're drinking a lot, it inhibits the effects of ADH. So ADH is being released, but it's not able to function on the kidneys to retain water, so you urinate really frequently. And even though you may be getting dehydrated from losing all of that liquid, the ADH doesn't let the body, that doesn't work, so the body doesn't retain the fluid. And that's why even when you're drinking heavily, if it's alcohol, you become dehydrated. I'm not going to talk much about oxytocin, which is the second posterior pituitary hormone. We'll talk about it a little more when we do reproduction, but know that oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth and is also kind of colloquially known as the cuddle hormone. So higher levels of oxytocin have been associated with greater maternal-infant bonding behaviors. The other thing to know about oxytocin is that it is often given in a synthetic form called Pitocin and used to induce labor or to speed labor along. All right, that's the end of the pituitary gland. I'm going to move on to the thyroid. If you have any questions, please write them down and ask me in class, and we'll go over them, of course. So, thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is kind of funny. So its big thing is that it removes iodine from your blood. You guys have probably heard about iodine. We make sure our salt is iodized. We make sure we get enough of it, and that is for your thyroid function, okay? The thyroid gland is the only thing in your body that takes up iodine. So, what stimulates it? Well, we just went over the anterior pituitary glands, and we talked about TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus, stimulating the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, and the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland. So this is under the control of that hypothalamic pituitary axis. The anatomy of the thyroid gland is it's made of something called a follicle, which is these little blobs that we're looking at here. Okay, so these are the follicles of the thyroid gland. They are little open spaces full of a substance called colloid and surrounded by follicular cells, which are cuboidal cells. And the follicular cells go right around the follicles, and then on the outside you have extrafollicular cells, so right outside of the follicles. And the follicular cells and the extrafollicular cells, while they don't look very distinct, they actually release different hormones, and so that becomes important when you're looking at thyroid function. So the follicular cell, right? So these are the ones, the follicular cell hormones are the ones that are right around the outside like this, okay? The follicular cell thyroid hormones are T4 and T3. They are metabolic regulators, okay? T4 is also known as thyroxine, and T3 is also known as triiodothyronine, but you are perfectly welcome to use T4 and T3. Now, they're kind of funny. We're gonna basically treat them the same in class. Okay, T4 and T3 do the same thing, but there is way more T4 than T3 in your body. It actually is like 95% of the thyroid hormone. However, as a lipid, it's bound to plasma proteins in the blood. And because it's bound to plasma proteins to get around in the blood, it doesn't actually act on its target cells, which to me seems like I don't really understand why our body would do this. It seems very inefficient if 95% of the hormone is bound to plasma proteins and then it can't act on its target. So even though you have a ton more T4, T3 is free in plasma, and then that's the one that has the biggest effects on the target cells. So T3 is more physiologically relevant. Now, T4, thyroxine, T3, triiodothyronine, okay? What is the difference between these two compounds visually? They're pretty similar, except for T3 is missing one I. The I's are molecules of iodine. So T4 has 4 iodines, T3 has 3 iodines. Iodine is absolutely essential for creating the thyroid hormones. That's why your thyroid takes up iodine. It needs iodine to make T4 and T3. If you don't have iodine, you can't make T4 and T3. You don't have your thyroid hormones, and they are really, really important. So, I already told you that The thyroid hormones are metabolic regulators. What does that actually mean? It means that they control your body's metabolism. So, for carbohydrates, they increase the rate that cells release energy from carbohydrates. So they increase the utilization of carbohydrates for energy, okay? Make your body work faster. Burn those carbohydrates up. Get the energy out. For proteins, they increase protein synthesis. They make more. More proteins, more function. They also stimulate the breakdown and mobilization of lipids, all right? So how much you're using your fats, where you're moving them in your body. Are you storing them in the liver? Are you using them for energy? All of these things, okay? They take your food sources, they break stuff down, use energy, build proteins, move your lipids around. They regulate your metabolism. Thus, the thyroid hormones are a major determinant of how many calories the body must consume to maintain life at rest. Okay? This is your basal metabolic rate. What you need, what your metabolic rate is, how many calories you need to eat just to stay alive. Okay? Those are the follicular cell hormones, metabolic effectors, okay? Now, extrafollicular cells, back up. Boop, boop, boop. These guys that hang out here outside the follicles release a different hormone, and it's one we talked about a lot in A&P1. So, calcitonin. What does calcitonin do? It stimulates the activity of osteoblasts. Osteoblasts take calcium from your blood, okay, out of your blood. If there's too much calcium in your blood, it takes calcium out of your blood and it puts it in bone by the process of deposition, depositing calcium in bone. So, calcitonin is released in response to high levels of blood calcium. If you have high levels of blood calcium, the thyroid senses it, the extrafollicular cells release calcitonin. Calcitonin stimulates the osteoblasts, and they put some of that calcium into bone. Back for a second. The secretion of calcitonin, okay, is different from T3 and T4 because it is not under control of the hypothalamus or the pituitary. So TRH and TSH, coming from the hypothalamus and the pituitary, have no effect on the release of calcitonin. They just affect T3 and T4. Calcitonin release is stimulated by levels of blood calcium, right? So make sure that is very clear and very separate in your mind. So thyroid disorders, you guys have probably heard of these. They're pretty common. Know someone who has them, okay? If the thyroid is overactive in an adult, the condition is called hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease. Okay, people that have hyperthyroid disorders have a really high metabolic rate. So they end up being very thin, even though they eat a lot. They're very skinny. Okay, they're very sensitive to heat because their body is constantly burning energy up and making heat. So more heat makes them really hot. They're restless. They have weight loss. They actually have protruding eyes. Okay, that is hyperthyroid. If you're hyperthyroid and it is serious enough, you could actually just have your thyroid gland removed, and then doctors would regulate your hormones by giving you thyroid hormone to take as a medication. If your thyroid is underactive, then you have hypothyroidism. Okay, hypothyroidism is characterized by weight gain. Even though you don't eat a lot, so you just don't have a metabolism. Your body is not burning the stuff that it's taking in. Sensitivity to cold, okay, the opposite of the hyperthyroid. Low metabolic rate, mental dullness, swollen tissues, hypothyroid. Now this is a goiter, like I talked about earlier. And goiters are generally caused by iodine deficiency. So you should try and think about why a goiter would be caused by iodine deficiency. And I put the negative feedback cycle up on this slide so that you could look at that and try and figure this out. And I want someone to tell me on Tuesday. that is the end of our thyroid section. Again, if you have any questions, please write them down, email me, and we'll go over them. And last but not least for this lecture, the parathyroid gland, okay? So the parathyroid glands, there's 4 of them, sit on the posterior surface of the thyroid, right? So you're looking kind of at the back of the thyroid here, and you have 4 parathyroid glands, 2 little ones on each side. Parathyroid glands, you know from A&P1, secrete parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone has the opposite effect of calcitonin. So it is stimulated by low concentrations of blood calcium. You need calcium in your blood. If there is not enough, then the parathyroid gland will release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone goes on and does a few things. One that we talked about the most last semester was increasing the activity of osteoclasts to break down bone, but there's actually 2 other mechanisms for parathyroid hormone to increase calcium in your blood. So there are 3 total ways that parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels. Here's another one of our fancy figures with a bloodstream and 3 different colors of arrows, okay? So here's the parathyroid glands. Decreased blood calcium stimulates parathyroid hormone, PTH. It is released into the bloodstream, all right? So that's what causes the release, not the hypothalamus, not the pituitary, decreases in blood calcium. Parathyroid hormone stimulates the release of calcium from bone. This is where the osteoclasts come in, okay? Osteoclasts break down bone, and that puts calcium back into the blood. Parathyroid hormone also stimulates the kidneys to conserve calcium, and in the kidneys can activate vitamin D. They can make vitamin D. So you have the kidneys already conserving calcium, keeping it in your body, and activating vitamin D. Now here's the calcium coming from the kidneys back into the blood. That active vitamin D coming from the kidneys stimulates the intestines to absorb more calcium from your diet, okay? So active vitamin D means the intestines are going to take more calcium in, and then that will be in your blood. So there are 3 mechanisms by which parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium. Increases in blood calcium inhibit further secretion of parathyroid hormone. That is the end of that lecture. Thank you all for listening. I hope it was clear. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you on Tuesday. Don't forget to listen to the second one.